Dearborn, Michigan. Winter 1963. The lights in the engineering building are still on at midnight. They have been on at midnight every night for 6 weeks straight. The men inside are not working overtime because someone told them to. They are working because they have seen something on paper that most engineers only dream about. A number, a theoretical output figure that their calculations keep returning to no matter how many times they run them. And every time that number comes back, the same thing happens in that room. Someone puts down their pencil. Someone else stops talking. And for a moment, the only sound is the hum of fluorescent lights above drafting tables covered in engine schematics that nobody outside this building is supposed to see. The number was 600 horsepower from a naturally aspirated pushrod V8. In 1963, at a time when the entire American automotive industry considered 400 horsepower to be the outer boundary of what was physically achievable without forced induction or exotic fuel, 600 horsepower was not an engineering target. It was a declaration of intent. A statement that Ford Motor Company had decided the horsepower race was going to end on their terms, on their timeline, and at a number that nobody else was even close to chasing. What those engineers were building in that room would become the most technologically advanced American V8 ever conceived for production competition. It would rewrite every assumption the industry held about what a pushrod engine could accomplish. It would send NASCAR officials into emergency meetings and force sanctioning body rule changes that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with the fact that one company had built something the competition could not answer. The Ford 427 single overhead cam engine. The Cammer. And before it ever turned a wheel in competition, NASCAR would make sure it never got the chance. To understand why Ford built something this extreme, you have to understand the position the company found itself in by 1963. The Total Performance Program that Henry Ford II had launched was not a marketing exercise. It was a corporate mandate delivered from the top of the organization with the kind of clarity that leaves no room for misinterpretation. Ford would compete everywhere. NASCAR, Le Mans, Indianapolis, drag strips, road courses. Everywhere that performance was measured publicly, Ford would show up with the best equipment it could build, and it would win. Not occasionally, consistently, dominantly, in a way that connected directly to showroom traffic and purchase decisions and the bottom line that ultimately justified every dollar spent on racing programs. The 427 side oiler that Ford had been campaigning in NASCAR was a serious engine. A genuinely competitive piece of engineering that had given Ford real results on superspeedways where the combination of displacement and aerodynamic efficiency produced lap times that Chrysler's teams had to work hard to match. But serious was not enough anymore. Chrysler had arrived at Daytona in 1964 with the 426 Hemi and demonstrated in the most public way imaginable that serious was a different category from dominant. Ford's engineers watched what happened at Daytona and went back to Dearborn with a single objective: build something the Hemi cannot touch. Not something competitive. Not something that closes the gap. Something that makes the gap irrelevant because it is so far beyond what the Hemi could do that the conversation stops being about competition and starts being about a different class of engineering entirely. The man who led that effort was not a name that appears in many history books outside of dedicated automotive research circles. Russ Hagenbuch was Ford's engine development chief, and he approached the Cammer project with the systematic intensity of someone who understood that incrementalism was not going to solve the problem Ford was facing. The 427 block that already existed was the foundation. What Hagenbuch's team was going to put on top of that block was something American V8 engineering had never attempted at production scale. A single overhead camshaft on each cylinder bank. The conventional American V8 of the early 1960s used a single camshaft mounted in the valley of the block, operating the valves through a system of push rods and rocker arms that added mechanical complexity and placed physical limits on how aggressively the valve train could be tuned at high RPM. The pushrod system worked. It had worked for decades, but it worked within constraints that a serious engineer could identify precisely. The mass of the moving components, the flex in the push rods under high RPM loads, the limits on valve lift and duration that the geometry of the system imposed. Every one of those constraints was a ceiling on power. Hagenbuch's team removed that ceiling by mounting a camshaft directly above each cylinder bank operating the valves through short, lightweight rocker arms with minimal mechanical distance between the cam lobe and the valve stem. The cammer eliminated the pushrod entirely. What replaced it was a valve train that could be tuned with a precision and aggression that the conventional setup could not approach. Higher lift, more duration, faster opening and closing rates that allowed the combustion chamber to breathe at RPM levels where a pushrod engine would be fighting its own mechanical limitations. The camshafts themselves were driven by a duplex roller chain running from the crankshaft, a chain so long that Ford's engineers had to develop a new tensioning system to keep it stable at high RPM. The chain cover that resulted from this engineering challenge was massive, stretching the full height of the front of the engine in a way that made the cammer instantly visually distinctive from anything else in a racing paddock. You did not need to read a badge or ask a question. You looked at the front of that engine, and you knew immediately that you were looking at something that had been built by people operating at a different level. The cylinder heads that sat atop this architecture were the product of the same obsessive attention to airflow that defined every other decision in the camera's development. Larger valves than any comparable American V8. Port geometry designed around the specific requirements of the overhead cam layout. Combustion chamber shapes that worked with the hemispherical influence that Chrysler had demonstrated was the correct direction without copying the specific solutions that Chrysler had patented. When the first complete camera fired on the dyno at Dearborn, the output figure that came off that run landed in a range that Ford's own engineers had difficulty fully accepting, even as they were reading it. The Hemi had 425 horsepower officially. The Cammer had left that number behind before it reached its power peak, and NASCAR had not seen a single lap of it yet. The word got out the way words always get out in motorsport. Not through press releases or official announcements or the carefully managed information channels that corporate communications departments exist to control. It got out through the people who had been in the room, through the mechanics who had heard it running and couldn't keep what they had heard entirely to themselves, through the engineers who had friends at other companies and understood that what they were sitting on was the kind of information that changes the competitive landscape of an entire sport the moment it becomes known. By early 1964, the NASCAR paddock was already running on rumors about what Ford had built in Dearborn. The numbers being whispered were dismissed by some as exaggeration. By the men who had spent their careers around racing engines and understood instinctively what was and wasn't physically possible, they were not dismissed. They were treated with the specific kind of quiet alarm that serious people reserve for information they cannot immediately counter. Chrysler's people heard, GM's people heard, and the people who ran NASCAR heard. What happened next was not a sporting response. It was not a technical committee convening to evaluate the Cammer against the existing rulebook and make a determination based on whether it met the established criteria for competition eligibility. What happened was a political response, the kind that occurs when an organization realizes that the rules it has written are about to produce an outcome it is not prepared to manage. Bill France Sr. had watched what the 426 Hemi had done at Daytona in February 1964. He had watched 3 Chrysler cars finish first, second, and third in the most important race on his calendar. He had watched the Ford and GM teams get comprehensively embarrassed by a single-engine family in its competitive debut, and he had responded by finding a technical argument to remove the Hemi from competition for 1,965, an argument that everyone in the sport understood was manufactured for a specific purpose rather than derived from a genuine regulatory principle. Now Ford was arriving with something that made the Hemi look like a modest improvement over the status quo. France made his decision before the Cammer ever appeared at a NASCAR event. Before it had turned a single competitive lap. Before any NASCAR technical official had inspected it, measured it, evaluated it against the rulebook, or produced any documented finding that it violated any existing regulation. The 427 SOHC Cammer was banned from NASCAR competition in 1965. The official reasoning was familiar in its construction, if not in its specific language. The overhead cam configuration, NASCAR determined, did not meet the production-based specifications that governed engine eligibility for the series. The Cammer was a racing engine, not a production engine. It was not available to the general public through normal commercial channels. Therefore, it could not compete. Ford's response was immediate and furious. The company had invested an enormous amount of engineering time and corporate money into the Cammer program, specifically for NASCAR competition. The total performance mandate that came directly from Henry Ford II was not a suggestion that could be quietly set aside because a sanctioning body had decided the result was inconvenient. Ford had built this engine to race it in NASCAR, to use it to demonstrate publicly and definitively that Ford's engineering capability was superior to anything Chrysler or GM could put on a superspeedway. Having that engine banned before it competed was not a technical ruling. It was an act of institutional cowardice dressed in regulatory language, and Ford's people said so with a directness that made the conversations uncomfortable for everyone involved. The argument Ford made was not without merit. The Cammer had been developed using the 427 block that was already in production and eligible for NASCAR competition. The overhead cam heads were the new development, but the principle of developing new cylinder heads for an existing block was not something NASCAR had previously treated as a disqualifying modification. Other manufacturers had developed heads for production blocks without facing eligibility challenges. The specific targeting of the Cammer felt to Ford's engineers and executives like exactly what it was: a rule applied selectively to eliminate a specific competitive advantage, rather than a principle applied consistently across the field. France was unmoved. The ban stood. What Ford did next revealed something important about how a company responds when institutional politics remove the arena it was preparing to dominate. They took the Cammer to the drag strips. NHRA and AHRA competition had different eligibility structures than NASCAR. The sanctioning bodies that governed quarter-mile racing were not operating under the same political pressures that France had been navigating, and the Cammer found a competitive home on the straight line that NASCAR had denied it on the human ovals. What happened on those drag strips in 1965 and 1966 was the public demonstration that NASCAR had worked so hard to prevent. Cammer-powered Mustangs and Fairlanes running in factory experimental classes were producing elapsed times and trap speeds that reset expectations for what a naturally aspirated American V8 could accomplish in competition. The numbers that Ford's engineers had seen on the dyno in Dearborn were being replicated in public, documented, witnessed by crowds that included plenty of people who understood exactly what they were seeing and why it mattered. Don Nicholson ran a Cammer Comet that became one of the most recognized drag racing vehicles of the mid-1960s. Gas Ronda campaigned a Cammer Mustang that won consistently enough to build a following that transcended the specific results and became something closer to a cultural phenomenon. These were not fringe competitors running obscure equipment at small regional events. These were front-page stories in the enthusiast press, photographic evidence, published nationally, of an engine doing exactly what Ford had built it to do. The irony was not lost on anyone paying attention. NASCAR had banned the Cammer to protect competitive balance on its superspeedways. The result was that the Cammer became famous in a different arena, building a reputation that the controlled environment of oval racing would never have allowed it to develop so freely. The ban had not contained the Cammer. It had redirected it toward an audience that was, in some ways, more influential than the NASCAR grandstands. The enthusiast press covered every Cammer result with the specific enthusiasm reserved for underdogs who are not actually underdogs. Everyone who followed performance motorsport in America understood by 1966 that Ford had built the most powerful naturally aspirated V8 in the country and had been prevented from racing it where it was built to race. Not because it broke any rule that existed before it arrived, but because the people running the sport had looked at what it could do and decided that what it could do was too much. Meanwhile, in Dearborn, the engineers who had built the Cammer were not sitting still. Development continued. The lessons learned from drag racing competition were feeding back into the engine program in ways that the NASCAR ban had actually accelerated rather than stopped. Without the constraints of oval racing homologation requirements, Ford's engineers could develop the Cammer in directions that pure NASCAR competition would have limited. Tunnel port cylinder heads that pushed airflow beyond what the original design had achieved. Exotic camshaft profiles that extracted power from the architecture that the first-generation specifications had left on the table. The engine that had been banned to stop Ford was becoming, in the environment the ban had created, something even more extreme than what NASCAR had feared in the first place. And the men responsible for that ban were beginning to understand that removing something from competition does not remove it from development. It just removes your ability to control where that development goes. The drag strips could not contain it forever. Ford knew this. The engineers who had spent 2 years watching the Cammer dominate quarter-mile competition understood that they had built something too significant to exist permanently in the shadow of what it was supposed to be. The SOHC program had been conceived for superspeedway domination, for Daytona, for Talladega, for the high-speed sustained load competition where an engine's true character reveals itself not in a 10-second burst, but in lap after lap of full throttle commitment at speeds that punish any mechanical weakness without mercy or warning. The drag strip victories were real. The reputation they built was genuine. But every Ford engineer who watched a Cammer Mustang light the tires at a quarter-mile event knew they were watching a thoroughbred running a sprint. Impressive, undeniable, and fundamentally disconnected from the environment the engine had been designed to master. Ford pushed NASCAR repeatedly, through official channels and unofficial conversations and the kind of persistent institutional pressure that large corporations apply when they believe they have been treated unjustly and have the documentation to prove it. The arguments Ford made in those conversations were the same arguments they had made when the ban was first announced. The Cammer was developed from a production block. The overhead cam configuration was a legitimate engineering development, not a purpose-built racing component with no street application. Other manufacturers had developed cylinder heads for production blocks without facing eligibility challenges. NASCAR's position did not change. What changed instead was Ford's relationship with the series itself. In 1965, Ford made a decision that France had not anticipated and could not easily manage. They withdrew from NASCAR competition entirely, not a partial withdrawal, not a reduction in factory support while maintaining a nominal presence. A complete, documented, public withdrawal accompanied by a clear statement about why it was happening and who was responsible for the circumstances that made it necessary. The impact on NASCAR was immediate and serious. Ford had been one of the sport's primary manufacturer supporters. The removal of factory backing affected not just the competitive field, but the financial infrastructure that supported teams, the television relationships that were becoming increasingly important to the series, and the narrative that NASCAR presented to sponsors about the relevance of its competition to the automobiles that Americans were actually buying and driving. France felt the pressure from directions he had not fully accounted for when he made the decision to ban the Cammer. Sponsors who had aligned themselves with Ford's Total Performance program found the withdrawal inconvenient in ways that translated into conversations with NASCAR about the stability of the series as a commercial platform. Television partners who had been building their motorsport coverage around the manufacturer rivalries that gave NASCAR its competitive narrative found a Fordless field less compelling than the alternative. The negotiation that followed was not public. The conversations that eventually produced a path back for Ford into NASCAR competition happened in the same kind of rooms where the Cammer ban had originally been engineered. Away from cameras and press releases and the official record that sporting organizations maintain for public consumption. What Ford got from those conversations was not what they had originally wanted. The Cammer did not return to NASCAR. The ban on overhead cam engines remained in the rulebook where it has stayed, in various forms, through decades of subsequent rule revisions. What Ford got instead was a commitment from NASCAR that the rules governing engine eligibility would be applied consistently, and that the kind of targeted regulatory action that had produced the Cammer ban would not be repeated in the same manner. It was a compromise that satisfied nobody completely and both sides partially. The kind of outcome that institutional conflicts between powerful organizations typically produce when neither side can afford the full cost of continuing the fight indefinitely. Ford returned to NASCAR without the Cammer, with the 427 side oiler that had been their primary competition engine before the SOHC program had consumed the development agenda, and with a level of institutional distrust toward the sanctioning body that colored every subsequent interaction between Dearborn and NASCAR for years. But the Cammer itself had not finished its story. Not even close. The engine that NASCAR had banned continued developing in directions that the ban had made possible by removing the homologation constraints that competition eligibility would have imposed. By the late 1960s, Cammer-based engines in drag racing specification were producing output figures that Ford's original engineers would have found difficult to believe when they were running their first calculations in that Dearborn building in 1963. The tunnel port head development that had been pursued through the drag racing program had unlocked airflow characteristics that pushed the architecture significantly beyond its original performance envelope. Carroll Shelby, who understood better than almost anyone what Ford's engineering program was capable of when it was operating without political interference, had his own perspective on what the Cammer represented. Shelby had seen the engine running. He understood its architecture and what that architecture was capable of in the hands of builders who knew how to use it. His assessment, shared privately with people whose technical judgment he respected, was that a fully developed Cammer, in unrestricted competition specification, represented the outer boundary of what American V8 engineering could achieve through the approach that had defined the muscle car era. Not an incremental improvement. The limit. The place where the fundamental architecture of the American pushrod-derived V8 had been pushed as far as the physics would allow before a different approach became necessary. The collectors who began pursuing Cammer-equipped vehicles in the decades following the muscle car era were not simply buying rare machinery. They were acquiring documented evidence of a specific moment in American engineering history when one company had decided that the rules of the game were insufficient to contain what they were capable of building and had built. Accordingly, original Cammer-equipped Fairlanes and Mustangs from the factory experimental drag racing program began appearing at auction with price tags that reflected the combination of genuine rarity and outsized historical significance that defines the most valuable muscle-era machinery. A documented Cammer vehicle with competition history and verifiable provenance commands figures in modern auction environments that place it among the most significant American performance cars ever built. Not because it won championships, it was banned before it could. Not because it dominated the series it was built for. It never got the opportunity. But because the people who understand what it represented, what it took to build it, what it meant that an organization powerful enough to shape the rules of American motorsport had looked at it and decided the only response was to make it illegal, those people understand that the Cammer's story is not a story about what was lost. It is a story about what could not be stopped. NASCAR took away the racetrack. They could not take away the dyno sheets. They could not take away the drag strip time slips. They could not take away the photographs of tunnel port heads that redefined what cylinder head engineering meant in the context of American V8 development. They could not take away the knowledge that accumulated in the hands of the builders and tuners and engineers who worked with the Cammer through the years when NASCAR pretended it did not exist. And they could not take away the simple, documented, undeniable fact that Ford had built the most powerful, naturally aspirated American V8 of its era, that they had built it specifically to race it in the sport that banned it, and that the ban itself was the clearest possible admission that nothing in that sport could have beaten it if it had been allowed to run. The 427 SOHC Cammer did not lose because it was beaten. It was removed because beating it was not possible. That is the difference. And 60 years later, in the hands of collectors who understand exactly what they are preserving and why it matters, that difference is worth more than any trophy NASCAR ever awarded to the engines that were allowed to compete in its place. They feared it enough to ban it before it raced. That is not a footnote in American automotive history. That is the whole story.